Good day, and today we're going to introduce you to English literature in the 19th century, also known as the Victorian Age. Now, in Britain, the 19th century is traditionally called the Victorian Age. Victorian is a descriptive term for the time when Victoria was Queen of England, around from 1837 to 1901. Now, the Victorian period of England is known as a time of industrial progress, colonial expansion, and public fastidiousness in morals. Now, the Victorian period in the United States has many of the same characteristics, but as you can see from our list of our writers here, we're going to concentrate on the 19th century Victorian age from the English literature point of view. So let's start off with our first author, Alfred Tennyson. Alfred Tennyson was born in Somersby in Lincolnshire. He began to write poetry at an early age in the style of Lord Byron. Tennyson studied at Trinity College in Cambridge, where he joined the Literary Club. Now, Tennyson was very popular in his own time. He was actually the Poet Laureate of Britain for over 40 years. Now, among his famous works are Crossing the Bar and Idylls of the King, which is a retelling of the legend of King Arthur. His arguably most famous poem is The Charge of the Light Brigade, a poem that celebrates the heroism of a British cavalry brigade in its doomed assault on much larger forces. Tennyson was buried in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. His birth and death dates are 1809 to 1892. Our next British author is Robert Browning. Browning grew up in Camberwell in southeast London, and he was educated at home where he had access to his father's extensive library. Now, at an early age, he was inspired by the work of romantic poets such as Byron, Keats, and Shelley. And in 1845, he began corresponding with Elizabeth Barrett after reading and enjoying some of her poems. The couple eventually married in secret and then eloped to Italy in 1846. Although quintessentially a Victorian poet, Browning's work was hugely influential in heralding and modernism. Now, after his wife's death in 1861, Browning returned to England and continued to write poetry. His best-known collections include The Ring and the Book and Men and Women. His last collection of poems, As Orlando, was published on the day of his death. Robert Browning is buried in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey in London, England. His memorial stone is made from Italian marble and porphyry. And his birth and death dates are 1812 to 1889. Next is Robert's wife, Elizabeth Browning. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born at Coxall Hall in County Durham in England. Now, young Elizabeth benefited from a privileged life in the country. Although frail at times, she still enjoyed physical pursuits like riding her pony and attending social gatherings with family and friends. Similar to her future husband, Robert Browning, she was a voracious reader. Her father encouraged her to write, and in 1820 had 50 copies of her narrative poem, The Battle of Marathon, printed. Elizabeth is best known for Sonnets from the Portuguese. The love that Brownings had for each other has been much celebrated, and in 1861, however, Elizabeth Barrett Browning died in her husband's arms. Her husband survived her by 28 years. And Elizabeth Browning's death dates are 1806 to 1861. Next poet we have is Algernon Swinburne. Swinburne was an English poet and a critic. Born in London, the son of an admiral, he was educated in France, Eton, and Balliol College, Oxford, although he did fail to graduate. While he had had plays published and some evidence of poetic voice, his first serious poetic excursion was with Poems and Ballads in 1866. Swinburne continued to write continuously, and his output was truly impressive. He also took up literary criticism and wrote on Baudelaire, Blake, Hugo, Byron, and many others. The criticism was variable in quality and ranged from incisive erudition to simply just unjustified attacks on the other authors. He remained with Watts Dunton in Putney until his death in 1909. He was a prolific writer of poetry, plays, and novels, and his notable works were Av at Vale and The Tale of Balin. And Algernon's birth and death dates are 1837 to 1909. Our next British author is Rudyard Kipling. He was born in Bombay, India, and young Rudyard's earliest years in Bombay were blissfully happy. But at the age of 5, he was sent to England, where he was desperately unhappy. When he was 12, he went to the college at Westward, where the headmaster fostered his literary ability. Kipling eventually would come back to India when he was 17, and at 21, he published his first book of poems. Now, a year later, he wrote a book of short stories about India, and between 1887 and 1899, Kipling visited many countries. During that time, he wrote some of his best works. These were his children's stories about animals and some history books. And in 1907, he'd accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature. And his birth and death dates are 1865 to 1936. And with Kipling, there are a lot of books. Some of the arguably most famous would probably be The Jungle Book and The Second Jungle Book in 1894 and in 1895, Gunga Din in 1892, and then you have the Just So stories, his short stories in 1902. Our next critic and poet is William Ernest Henley. Henley was born at Gloucester and educated at the Crypt Grammar School, and at age of 12, Henley became a victim of tuberculosis of the bone. After his recovery, Henley earned his living in publishing, and in 1889, he became editor of the Scots Observer, an Edinburgh journal in the lines of the Old Saturday Review, but inspired in every paragraph by Henley's vigorous and combative personality. Henley collaborated with Robert Louis Stevenson on 4 plays and wrote several volumes of poetry. Now, epitomized by his most famous poem, Invictus, is Henley's characteristic admiration for courageous, active, and joyful acceptance of life's difficulties. And among his works are Views and Reviews, Song of the Sword, London Voluntaries, Macaire, Pro Reg Nostro, very, very prolific author, and his birth and death dates are 1849 to 1903. Our next Victorian British author is Edward Lear. Edward Lear was born in Holloway in London. He spent his early years first as a draftsman for the Zoological Society, and then as an artist for the British Museum. He published accounts of his trips to Italy, Albania, and Corsica. He also visited the Holy Land in Greece. He's chiefly remembered for his nonsense poetry, the first volume of which was written for his patron's grandchildren in 1846, and it was simply entitled A Book of Nonsense. It contained Lear's favorite poetic format, the limerick, and was illustrated throughout. His poetry was henceforth marked by an air of ludicrous fantasy, as well as a unique inventiveness. Since his death, appreciation of his artistic work, the watercolors in particular, has risen. His real fame, however, was secured by his poems from the Nonsense Songs in 1871, such as The Owl and the Pussycat. And Edward Lear's birth and death dates are 1812 to 1888. Our next Victorian British author is William Makepeace Thackeray. He was born in Calcutta, India, but after his father died, he was sent to England. He was educated at Charterhouse and at Trinity College in Cambridge. In 1837, Thackeray started his career as a hard-working journalist. In the 1840s, Thackeray started to gain name as a writer and also began writing novels. And in 1844, Fraser's Magazine serialized Barry Lyndon. In 1847, Thackeray published his most famous novel, Vanity Fair. This was followed by The History of Henry Esmond in 1852, Newcomes in 1853, and The Virginians in 1857. Although a successful novelist, Thackeray continued to write articles for journals such as Punch magazine. In 1859, he became editor of the Cornhill Magazine, a monthly literary journal published by George Smith. But he died suddenly on Christmas Eve, 1863, and is buried in Westminster Abbey. Thackeray's birth and death dates are 1811 to 1863. Our next Victorian age British author is Charles Dickens. He's generally regarded as one of the greatest English novelists. He mocked and denounced the social evils of Victorian England, as well as showing humor and pathos. Dickens told a good story without fear of sentimentalizing his characters. Now, Dickens, a man of keen social conscience, used his books to portray the suffering of the working class at the time of the Industrial Revolution. His works include A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, and numerous other novels. He created many memorable characters, including Bob Cratchit, Fagin, Uriah Heep, Jacob Marley, and Samuel Pickwick. His sentimentality and caricature are still widely appreciated, and many of his characters with their unusual names have entered popular folklore. Dickens established and made profitable the method of first publishing novels in serial installments in monthly magazines. He thereby reached a larger audience, including those who could only afford their reading on such an installment plan. This form of publication soon became popular with other writers in Britain and in the United States. And again, several of his novels have become quite famous, including The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield, Hard Times, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. Next, we'll move into the Brontë sisters, starting with Charlotte Brontë. She was born at Thornton in Yorkshire, and she's the third child of 6. The Reverend was later appointed as curate in the small village of Haworth on the Yorkshire moors, where Charlotte spent most of her life. Now, Charlotte wrote a series of poetry as well as 4 novels: The Professor, Jane Eyre, Shirley, and Villette. Now, in 1848, devastated by the loss of her 3 remaining siblings, she became dependent upon famous editors and friends for support. And in 1854, she married, and in 1855, at the age of 39, she died from tuberculosis and pregnancy complications. Charlotte's birth and death dates are 1816 to 1855. Next, her sister Emily. Emily was a British novelist and poet best remembered for her one novel, Wuthering Heights. Emily was born at Thornton in Yorkshire, the younger sister of Charlotte Brontë and the 5th of 6 children. In 1837, Emily commenced work as a governess at Law Hill near Halifax. Later, with her sister Charlotte, she attended college in Brussels. It was the discovery of Emily's poetic talent by her family that led her and her sisters, Charlotte and Anne, to publish a joint collection of their poetry in 1845. Owing to the prejudices on female writers, all 3 used male pseudonyms, Emily's being Ellis Bell. She subsequently published her only novel, Wuthering Heights, in 1847. Although it received mixed reviews when it first came out, the book subsequently became an English literary classic. Like her sisters, Emily's constitution had been weakened by their harsh life at home and at school. She died on December 19, 1848, of tuberculosis. Our next author from the Victorian age is George Eliot. And George Eliot was a pseudonym for Mary Ann Evans, a woman counted among England's best writers. Born in 1819, she spent the first 20 years of her life receiving an evangelical education and managing her father's household after her mother's death. Then she moved to Coventry and turned towards translating and journalism. After several years in London, she met George Henry Lewes, a man of letters estranged from his wife with no possibility of divorce. Notoriously, Evans and Lewes began living together in 1854 and did so until his death in 1878. Now, he encouraged her to move toward the writing of fiction. These fictional works include The Scenes of Clerical Life, Adam Beattie, The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner, Romola, Felix Holt, and Daniel Deronda. Now, Middlemarch in 1871 and 1872 is often regarded as her masterpiece. Evans died in 1880 shortly after marrying J.W. Cross, an old friend and admirer. Our next novelist is Anthony Trollope, a British novelist and a civil servant. He was born at Russell Square in London. Educated at Winchester College and Harrow School, he became a clerk in the post office in 1834 and was transferred to Ireland as post office surveyor in 1841. Trollope wrote an astonishing number of novels and several volumes of short stories. How this enormous total was achieved in spite of official work, which, lightly as he took it, he did a good deal, and which he did not give up for many years, of hunting 3 times a week in the season, whist playing, and of not going a little into general society, he has explained with his usual curious minuteness. His most successful books describe life in the imaginary cathedral city of Barchester. They include The Warden from 1855 and Barchester Towers in 1857. And his birth and death dates are 1815 to 1882. Our next novelist from the Victorian era is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Masterson Hardy was a novelist and a poet, generally regarded as one of the greatest figures in English literature. He was born near Dorchester in Dorset, and his first novel, The Poor Man and the Lady, was finished in 1867, but failed to find a publisher. Over the next 25 years, Hardy produced 10 more novels. Tess of the D'Urbervilles in 1891 attracted criticism for its sympathetic portrayal of a fallen woman and was initially refused publication. Besides, he wrote the novels Far from the Madding Crowd, Jude the Obscure, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and in 1898, Hardy published his first volume of poetry, Wessex Poems, a collection of poems written over the previous 30 years. Hardy died in 1928, dictating his final poem to his wife on his deathbed. Hardy was buried in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And Hardy's birth and death dates are 1840 to 1928. Our next Victorian author is Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish author of the 19th century and was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Robert Louis Stevenson lived a brief but remarkable life. Author of more than 40 books, which are novels and collections of essays and poems, Stevenson is best known for his adventure tales, including Kidnapped, The Black Arrow, and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Treasure Island is the most famous children's adventure story of all of them. Now, Stevenson spent the last few years of his life as a planter and a storyteller on Samoa in the Pacific Ocean. Called the Tale Teller by locals on the island of Samoa, Stevenson was equally admired by British readers for his writings about the art of craft of literature. And his birth and death dates are 1850 to 1894. Our next Victorian British author is Lewis Carroll. Now, Lewis Carroll's real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, an English writer and logician. Although by profession a mathematician at Oxford University, he's known internationally as the popular author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. These 2 books are very popular not only with children, but with adults. Both books tell stories of exciting and original adventures and have humorous characters. In the original editions, the imaginative illustrations by John Tennell added to the attractiveness of his text. And Lewis Carroll's birth and death dates are 1832 to 1898. Next is Herbert George Wells. Wells, who looked into the future, was born in Bromley, now a section of Greater London. He was 8 when he broke his leg on the cricket field, and while being ill, he read many books on natural history. While a student, H. Wells was interested in biology, and his earliest works were textbooks. Later, he became a professional writer of science fiction. Now, Wells devoted more than 50 years of his life to his literary work. Now, the author of more than 40 novels and many short stories and articles, H.G. Wells is known best for The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. And his birth and death dates are 1866 to 1946. Our next Victorian age writer is Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker was born in Clontarf in Ireland. he began publishing his stories in magazines regularly during his 8-year term at Dublin Castle. And some of his works were The Crystal Cup, The Chain of Destiny, The Spectre of Doom. Now, in 1878, Stoker accepted the job as a business manager for Sir Henry Irving's Lyceum Theatre, and in 1882, Stoker published his first book, Under the Sunset, and his first full-length novel, The Snake's Past, which followed in 1890. His most famous work is Dracula from 1897, which is considered one of the best horror tales ever written. Dracula tells the story of a vampiric count pursued relentlessly by those who would see him destroyed. In 1905, Sir Henry Irving died, and his death caused Stoker to have a stroke. But Stoker continued to write, publishing among others The Jewel of the Seven Stars, personal reminiscences of Henry Irving, and The Lair of the White Worm in 1911. And Bram Stoker's birth and death dates are 1847 to 1912. Author Conan Doyle is born in the capital of Scotland in Edinburgh. His father was an artist and an architect by profession, and his mother was a good storyteller. With this talent Arthur took from his mother, it helped him as a writer. He was one of the first to start the fashion of detective stories, and in 1887, Arthur published his first detective story, A Study in Scarlet. Its main characters were Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and they became the most popular characters of a great many of Conan Doyle's stories. He wrote more than 20 stories about Sherlock Holmes, and after his death in 1930, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson continue to be among the favorite characters of English literature. Besides detective stories, he also wrote historical novels and fantastic stories. And Doyle's birth date and death dates are 1859 to 1930. We also have George Bernard Shaw in the Victorian age. Born in Dublin, Ireland, George Bernard Shaw was the only son and third and youngest child. At 15, Shaw began working as a bookkeeper in a land agent's office. Outside of work, books, theater, and art captured his attention, but it was music that pervaded his home. The first years in London, 1876 to 1884, were filled with frustration and poverty. Shaw spent his days in the British Museum reading room-writing novels and reading, and his evenings attending lectures and debates by the middle-class intelligentsia. He became a vegetarian, a socialist, a skillful orator, and developed his first beginnings as a playwright. Shaw began his journalism career as a book reviewer and art, music, and drama critic. Now, Shaw's writings were often controversial, as in The Philanderer of 1898, a play about the new woman, and Mrs. Warren's Profession, depicting organized commercial prostitution. Shaw was known for his outspokenness and barbed humor. His many plays include Pygmalion, Androcles and the Lion, Man and Superman, and St. Joan. And his birth date and death dates are 1856 to 1950. And finally, Oscar Wilde. He was born in Dublin. His mother, Lady Jane Francesca Wilde, was a writer of verse and prose. Now, Wilde spent most of his career in England, and after graduating from university, Wilde turned his attention to writing, traveling, and lecturing. Wilde wrote poems, plays, essays, reviews, letters. He wrote it all. He attracted the attention of his audiences by the brilliance of his conversation and his knowledge. In his works, especially in his fairy tales, he glorifies beauty of nature and beauty of devoted love. The theme of most of his work is quite realistic. He shows the contrast between wealth and poverty. His own sympathy for the poor laboring people is quite evident, and when released from prison in 1897, he lived in Paris. By 1898, he was publishing his poem Ballad of Reading Jail, revealing his concern for inhumane prison conditions. Shortly after, he died in a cheap Paris hotel at the age of 46. And Oscar Wilde's birth and death dates are 1854 to 1900. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn a little bit about the Victorian age of English literature. If you'd like to learn more about these authors, leave a comment down below. Let me know who I've missed or who else you'd like to learn more of. Or if you'd like me to also do this as a series, maybe do Victorian age authors from the United States or from France. Also leave a comment down below. Let me know what other authors I can cover. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.